The gunshot that killed Amelia Norton's father echoed through the San Francisco banking hall on a Tuesday morning in April 1878, and by Wednesday afternoon, she found herself on a stagecoach heading east toward the Sierra Nevada foothills with nothing but a leather satchel, her mother's wedding ring, and a future she had never imagined. The city she had known all her 22 years disappeared behind clouds of dust as the horses pulled her away from everything familiar, away from the life of comfort and expectation that had been carefully constructed around her since birth, away from the man she was supposed to marry in 3 weeks' time. Her father had been a prominent banker, respected and feared in equal measure by the men who lined up at his mahogany desk, seeking loans and favors. The robbery had been swift and brutal. 3 masked men who had walked in during morning hours when the vault was being opened for daily business. Her father had tried to be a hero, reaching for the pistol he kept in his desk drawer, and they had shot him twice in the chest before fleeing with less than $200. The irony was not lost on Amelia that he had died protecting money that belonged to other people, money that meant nothing now that he was gone. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people who claimed to love him, but Amelia had seen the calculation in their eyes, the quick mental arithmetic of what his death meant for their own fortunes and futures. Her engagement to Frederick Worthington Roman III, son of her father's business partner, had been announced 6 months earlier to great fanfare in society pages. The wedding was meant to merge 2 banking dynasties, create an empire that would dominate West Coast finance for generations. But standing beside her father's casket, watching Frederick's cold eyes assess the situation with the same detachment he applied to balance sheets, Amelia had felt something inside her crack, and then shatter completely. She had told Frederick the wedding was postponed. He had nodded, patted her hand with the warmth of someone touching a business document, and suggested a delay of 2 months to allow for proper mourning. When she said she needed time to think, to grieve, to understand who she was without her father's shadow, he had frowned and reminded her that the merger between their families was already in motion, that contracts had been signed, that expectations had been set. She had looked at him then, really looked at him for perhaps the first time since their engagement, and seen nothing that moved her, nothing that made her heart race or her breath catch. She had agreed to marry him out of duty, because it was what her father wanted, what society expected, what made sense for a woman in her position. But her father was dead, and the duty she owed him had died with him, so she had done something she never thought herself capable of. She had withdrawn what money was left in her personal account, packed a single bag, and purchased a ticket to Sonora, California, where her father's estranged sister lived. Aunt Beatrice had left San Francisco 20 years earlier after a scandal involving a married man and a baby that was never mentioned in polite company. She had disappeared into the rough gold country of the foothills, and the family had erased her from their story as though she had never existed. But Amelia had found old letters in her father's study while sorting through his papers, letters from Beatrice that he had never answered but also never destroyed. The most recent was from just 6 months ago, a birthday greeting that included an address and an open invitation should Amelia ever need a place away from the pressures of city life. The stagecoach climbed into the foothills as the afternoon lengthened into evening. Amelia watched the landscape transform from the gentle valleys around San Francisco to something wilder and more rugged. Pine trees replaced cultivated gardens, rocky outcroppings jutted from hillsides like broken teeth, and the air carried scents of sage and dust rather than sea salt and coal smoke. The other passengers in the coach were a quiet lot, a merchant heading to Sacramento, an older woman who might have been a school teacher, and a young man who kept his hat pulled low and said nothing at all. They stopped for the night at a way station where the food was terrible and the beds were hard. Amelia lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, coyotes calling in the distance, wind rattling through pine branches, the restless stamping of horses in the corral. She thought about Frederick, wondered if he had noticed yet that she was gone, what he would tell his father, how quickly they would move to protect their financial interests now that the wedding was in doubt. She thought about her own mother, dead these past 10 years from pneumonia, and wondered what she would have thought of her daughter running away from duty and security to seek out a disgraced aunt in a rough mining town. But mostly she thought about passion, about the complete absence of it in her life up until now. She had read novels where heroines spoke of consuming love, of feelings that overrode sense and propriety, of connections that felt like destiny rather than arrangement. She had always dismissed such things as fantasy, the inventions of writers who had never lived in the real world of social obligation and economic necessity. Yet lying there in that crude way station bed, she wondered if perhaps she had been wrong, if perhaps there was more to life than duty and expectation, if perhaps her father's death had given her an unexpected gift, the freedom to find out who she might become if she followed her heart rather than her head. The stagecoach reached Sonora late the following afternoon. The town sprawled across the hillside in a haphazard collection of wooden buildings, false fronts, and muddy streets. It had been a booming gold camp in the early 50s, and though the easy placer gold was long gone, enough mining operations remained to keep the town alive and rough around the edges. Saloons outnumbered churches, gambling halls did steady business, and the people who walked the boardwalks had the look of those who had come west seeking fortune and found mostly hard work and harder luck. Amelia stood beside her bag on the main street, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked in her traveling dress of dark blue silk, her carefully styled hair, her posture that spoke of finishing schools and deportment lessons. A group of miners passed by, their eyes lingering on her with an attention that made her skin prickle with unease. She clutched her bag tighter and looked around for someone to ask about her aunt's whereabouts. A general store stood across the street, its windows displaying an assortment of goods from mining equipment to dry goods to ready-made clothing. She crossed to it, stepping carefully to avoid the worst of the mud, and pushed through the door. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee and leather and tobacco. A man stood behind the counter, middle-aged and balding, regarding her with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for exotic animals. "Help you, miss?" he asked. "I am looking for Mrs. Beatrice Norton," Amelia said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand she lives in Sonora." The man's eyebrows rose. "Beatrice Norton, you mean B. She runs the boarding house up on Bradford Street. Yellow building, can't miss it." He paused, studying her more carefully. "You family?" "Her niece." His expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. "Well then, welcome to Sonora, miss. Bradford Street is 2 blocks north, then west toward the hill. Like I said, yellow building." She thanked him and left the store, following his directions through streets that grew quieter as she moved away from the commercial center of town. The boarding house was indeed impossible to miss. A 2-story structure painted a cheerful yellow that seemed defiant in the midst of so much unpainted wood and weathered gray. A sign out front read, "Norton House Clean Rooms, Fair Rates, No Nonsense." Amelia climbed the steps to the front porch and knocked on the door. Footsteps approached from inside, And then the door swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s with graying blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, intelligent eyes, and a face that showed both the beauty she had once possessed and the character she had earned through years of living on her own terms. "Yes," the woman said, then stopped, her eyes widening as she took in Amelia's face. "Dear God, you look just like Margaret." "Aunt Beatrice," Amelia said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "I am Amelia, Thomas Norton's daughter." Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment she simply stared. Then she reached out and pulled Amelia into an embrace that smelled of lavender and bread flour and something indefinably comforting. "Come in, child. Come in right now and tell me what has happened." The interior of the boarding house was clean and comfortable in a way that spoke of care rather than wealth. Beatrice led Amelia to a kitchen at the back of the house, sat her down at a scrubbed pine table, and put a kettle on for tea. Then she sat across from her niece and listened as Amelia told her everything: her father's death, the wedding she could not face, the life in San Francisco that had suddenly seemed like a cage. When she finished, Beatrice reached across the table and took her hand. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "I know what it is to marry for duty, and I know what it cost me. My first husband was chosen by my family, a good match on paper, and I was miserable from the wedding night onward. When I met Robert, when I felt what it was to actually want someone, to feel alive in another person's presence, I knew I could not go back to that empty marriage. Yes, there was scandal. Yes, I lost everything I had known. But I have never regretted choosing passion over duty, not for a single moment." "But you lost the baby," Amelia whispered, remembering the fragments of gossip she had overheard as a child. "I did," Beatrice said, and her face showed the old grief. "A stillbirth 5 months after I came here. And Robert died 2 years after that in a mining accident. So yes, I have known loss, but I have also known real love, real joy, real living. And that is worth more than all the security and respectability I left behind." She squeezed Amelia's hand. "You can stay here as long as you need. Work in the boarding house if you want to earn your keep, though you are family and welcome regardless. Sonora is not San Francisco, but it is a place where a woman can make her own way if she has courage." Amelia felt tears sliding down her cheeks, relief and grief and gratitude all tangled together. "Thank you," she managed to say. That night she slept in a small room on the second floor, a simple space with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the hillside. She fell asleep to the sound of a piano playing somewhere down the street, a melancholy tune that seemed to capture everything she was feeling: loss and liberation, fear and hope, the ending of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. She woke to morning sun streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon rising from downstairs. She dressed quickly, realizing as she unpacked her bag that none of her San Francisco clothing was remotely practical for life in a mining town boarding house. The silks and fine cottons, the carefully pressed skirts with their elaborate bustles, the delicate shoes that were meant for carpeted parlors and paved streets, all of it seemed ridiculous now. Beatrice seemed to read her thoughts when she came down to breakfast. "We will get you some proper clothes," she said. "Simpler things, more durable. Sonora is not a place for fancy dress, and you will need clothes you can work in." "I want to help," Amelia said. "With the boarding house, with whatever needs doing. I do not want to be useless." Her aunt smiled. "You are Thomas's daughter, all right. He was many things, but never useless. Come, eat, and then I will show you how things run around here." The Norton house had 6 guest rooms, and at present 4 were occupied. There was a prospector named Jack who had been living there for 3 months while working a claim up in the hills. There was a widow named Mrs. Chen, who had come from San Francisco's Chinatown seeking a quieter life. There was a traveling preacher who moved from town to town giving sermons and baptizing children. And there was a cowboy who had arrived 2 weeks earlier and paid for a month in advance with gold coins that looked freshly minted. "That one is interesting," Beatrice said as she showed Amelia the room register. "Name is Daniel Brennan, keeps to himself mostly but polite, says he is here on business but does not say what kind." Amelia looked at the name written in the register in a bold, slanting hand. "Is that unusual?" "In Sonora. Everyone has secrets, child. The question is whether they are dangerous secrets or just private ones." Beatrice closed the register. "Daniel seems harmless enough, though I will say there is something about him that suggests he can handle himself if trouble comes calling." Amelia met Daniel Brennan that evening when the boarders gathered for dinner in the communal dining room. Beatrice prepared meals for those who wanted them, an additional service that added to the boarding house's reputation for comfort and value. Amelia helped serve, carrying platters of roasted chicken and bowls of potatoes and greens to the long table where the guests assembled. Daniel was the last to arrive, and she noticed him the moment he appeared in the doorway. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes of a startling blue-green that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore simple clothes, work pants and a cotton shirt, but carried himself with a confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, in a way that Frederick had never been despite all his social advantages. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27, old enough to have seen things and done things, young enough that life had not yet hardened him into bitterness. He nodded to Beatrice and took a seat at the end of the table. His eyes met Amelia's as she set down a platter of chicken, and she felt something unexpected, a flutter of awareness that was entirely inappropriate for a woman who had been engaged just days earlier. She looked away quickly, but felt his gaze follow her as she returned to the kitchen. "That is the cowboy," Beatrice murmured with a knowing look. "Handsome, is he not?" "I had not noticed," Amelia lied. Her aunt laughed quietly. "Of course not, which is why you are blushing." Dinner conversation flowed around topics of weather and mining prospects and news from Sacramento. Daniel said little, but listened with an attention that suggested he was genuinely interested in what others had to say. When the preacher launched into a lengthy story about baptizing twins in a river up near Nevada City, Daniel caught Amelia's eye across the table, and the corner of his mouth quirked in a way that might have been amusement. She found herself fighting back a smile, feeling absurdly like a schoolgirl being noticed by a boy she found attractive. After dinner, she helped Beatrice clear the table and wash dishes. Through the kitchen window, she could see Daniel on the back porch, smoking a thin cigar and looking out at the darkening hillside. There was something solitary about him, something that spoke of a man who was comfortable with his own company, but perhaps lonely nevertheless. "You should take him his coffee," Beatrice said, pressing a cup into Amelia's hands. "He always takes coffee after dinner, likes to sit out there and think." "I am sure he would prefer to be alone," Amelia protested. "And I am sure he would welcome the company of a pretty woman," her aunt countered. "Go on. You are not engaged anymore, remember? You are free to talk to whomever you like." So Amelia found herself walking out onto the back porch, coffee cup in hand, heart beating faster than such a simple errand warranted. Daniel turned as she approached, and up close she could see the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, the small scar above his left eyebrow that told of some past injury, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Mrs. Norton thought you might want coffee," she said, holding out the cup. He took it with a nod of thanks, his fingers brushing hers briefly in the exchange. "You are her niece from San Francisco." It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes, Amelia Norton. I arrived yesterday." Daniel Brennan. He took a sip of the coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. "San Francisco is a long way from Sonora. You must have a good reason for making that journey." "I do." She hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than invention. "My father died 2 weeks ago. I was engaged to be married, but after he passed, I realized I did not love the man I was promised to, so I came here instead." Daniel's expression shifted to something softer. "I am sorry about your father. That is a hard loss. Thank you." She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "What brings you to Sonora, Mr. Brennan? Daniel, please." He flicked ash from his cigar. "I am here looking for someone, actually. A man who might have passed through town recently." "Are you a lawman?" "Not exactly." He smiled slightly. "Let us say I am in the business of finding people who do not want to be found, for reasons that are sometimes legal and sometimes personal. A bounty hunter, among other things." He did not seem offended by the term. "I have also been a ranch hand, a trail guide, a deputy marshal for a while up in Montana. I go where the work takes me." Amelia found herself curious in a way she had not been curious about another person in longer than she could remember. "And does the work take you many places?" "Most of the West, at one time or another. I have seen the cattle ranges of Texas, the silver camps of Nevada, the wheat fields of Oregon. I have ridden with the cavalry chasing Comanche raiders, worked on the railroad crews laying track through the Rockies, panned for gold in the Yukon before the worst of winter drove me south again." He looked at her then, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I have never been to San Francisco. Tell me, is it as civilized as they say?" "Very civilized," she said. "So civilized that sometimes you can forget what it feels like to actually breathe." He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he suspected. "That is why you left." "Part of why." She met his gaze, feeling bold. "I wanted to know what it felt like to choose something for myself, rather than have it chosen for me." "And how does it feel?" "Terrifying," she admitted, "and also wonderful." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the night settling around them with its chorus of crickets and distant piano music. Then Daniel stubbed out his cigar and handed her the empty coffee cup. "Thank you for this, Miss Norton. It is good coffee and good company." "Amelia," she said. "If I am to call you Daniel, you should call me Amelia." "Amelia," he repeated, and the way he said her name, with a slight drawl that suggested Southern origins or time spent in Southern places, made it sound different than it ever had before. "I expect I will see you at breakfast." "You will," she confirmed, and returned to the kitchen feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Over the following days, Amelia settled into the rhythms of boarding house life. She helped Beatrice with cooking and cleaning, learned to make beds with military precision, discovered she had a talent for baking bread that surprised them both. The work was hard and her hands grew rough, but there was satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that her former life of social calls and charity committees had never provided. She saw Daniel at meals, and in passing as he came and went from the boarding house on whatever business brought him to Sonora. He was unfailingly polite, helping carry heavy items when he saw her struggling, holding doors, offering small courtesies that seemed natural rather than calculated. But there was also something else, a tension that hummed between them when their eyes met across the dining room, when they passed each other in the hallway, when she brought him coffee in the evenings, and they talked about everything and nothing on the back porch. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers, how he had left home at 17 after his father died, and the ranch had to be sold to pay debts. He spoke of learning to survive by his wits and his gun, of the hard lessons of frontier life, of the people he had met and the places he had seen. He had a way of telling stories that made them come alive, describing a stampede on the Kishom Trail so vividly she could almost hear the thunder of hooves, painting a picture of a Montana winter so harsh and beautiful she felt the cold and saw the snow-covered peaks. She told him about her life in San Francisco, the endless social obligations, the careful dance of courtship and status, the feeling of being an ornament rather than a person. She spoke of her father, his sternness and his rare moments of affection, the way he had mapped out her life as though she were a business venture to be managed. She told him about Frederick, how he had never once asked her what she wanted or what she dreamed of, how he had treated their engagement as a merger of assets rather than a union of hearts. "You regret it?" Daniel asked one evening. Leaving all that behind, she thought about it carefully. "Sometimes I miss the comfort, the security of knowing exactly what each day would hold. But no, I do not regret leaving. How could I regret choosing to live?" He looked at her then with an expression she could not quite read, something intense and searching. "You are braver than you think, Amelia Norton. Or more foolish," she said lightly. "Bravery and foolishness often look the same from the outside," he replied. "The difference is in whether you survive them." She laughed at that, and he smiled in response, and the moment felt charged with possibility, with the sense that something was building between them that neither had named but both recognized. It was Mrs. Chen who first mentioned the railroad dispute to Amelia. The older woman spoke limited English but had taken a liking to Amelia, teaching her simple Chinese phrases and showing her how to fold dumplings properly. One afternoon, as they worked together in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen grew agitated, pointing out the window toward the hills and speaking rapidly in Cantonese mixed with English. Beatrice came in and listened, then explained. "She is worried about her son. He works on a railroad crew that is trying to extend the line through the mountains to the east. There has been trouble with a rancher who owns land they need to cross. The railroad is threatening to use force to claim right-of-way, and the rancher has hired guns to protect his property. Mrs. Chen's son is caught in the middle, just trying to earn wages to send home to family in China." Amelia felt a chill. "Is anyone trying to negotiate a peace?" "In Sonora," Beatrice shook her head. "Most disputes here are settled with lawyers or guns, and the lawyers often do more damage than the bullets." That evening, Daniel did not appear for dinner. Amelia found herself watching the door, worried in a way that surprised her with its intensity. When he finally returned near midnight, she was still awake, unable to sleep for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and, acting on impulse, opened her door and stepped into the hallway. "Daniel," she called softly. He turned, and in the lamplight she could see that his clothes were dusty, his face drawn with fatigue. "Amelia, you should be sleeping." "So should you." She moved closer, noting the careful way he held himself as though something hurt. "Are you injured? Just bruised?" He tried to smile. "There was a disagreement at a saloon, nothing serious." "A disagreement about what?" He hesitated, then seemed to decide she deserved honesty. "About whether the railroad has the right to run men off their land at gunpoint. I was drinking with some of the railroad workers, heard them talking about plans to attack the rancher's homestead, force him out. I suggested that was a poor idea that would likely get people killed. They disagreed with my suggestion, forcefully." Amelia felt something warm spread through her chest, a feeling that was part admiration and part something more complicated. "You stood up for a stranger." I stood up for what was right, he corrected. Or at least for what seemed right in the moment. Happens sometimes when I have been drinking whiskey and my judgment goes soft. I do not think your judgment is soft, she said quietly. I think you are a good man, Daniel Brennan. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feeling. Amelia, I should tell you something. The man I came to Sonora to find, I found him 3 days ago. My business here is finished. I should move on. Her heart sank. Should, he repeated, but I am finding reasons to stay. Reasons that have nothing to do with business and everything to do with a woman who is braver than she knows, who makes me coffee in the evenings and listens to my stories like they matter, who left behind everything safe and comfortable to find out what living actually feels like. She could barely breathe. Daniel. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the dust and whiskey and leather scent of him, see the pulse beating in his throat, feel the heat radiating from his body. Tell me if I am reading this wrong, Amelia. Tell me if I am seeing something that is not there, and I will leave tomorrow and never trouble you again. You are not wrong, she whispered. You are not wrong about any of it. He reached up and cupped her face in his calloused hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with sudden tears. I have been all over this territory, seen things beautiful and terrible, known women in a dozen towns. But I have never met anyone who made me want to stay in one place until now, until you. I was engaged 2 weeks ago, she said, needing him to understand. I am not accustomed to feeling like this, to wanting like this. I do not know what I am doing. Neither do I, he admitted. But I know I do not want to stop. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her with a gentleness that quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest. She had been kissed before, chased pecks from Frederick that had felt like duty. But this was different. This was fire and need and connection. This was what all those novels had been describing, and she had never understood. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I am staying, he said. For as long as you want me here, I am staying. Stay, she said, and kissed him again, and felt the last remnants of her old life fall away like chains she had not realized she wore. They began courting in earnest after that, though courting seemed too tame a word for what was happening between them. Daniel took her riding into the hills on horses rented from the local stable, showing her places where wildflowers bloomed in defiant patches of color against the rocky soil, where streams ran clear and cold from snowmelt higher up, where you could see for miles across folded ridges of land that seemed to go on forever. She had never been a particularly skilled rider, but he was patient, teaching her how to sit properly, how to communicate with the animal beneath her, how to relax and trust rather than fight for control. They went to the town's weekly dance, held in a barn at the edge of Sonora, where a fiddle and guitar provided music, and the whole town seemed to gather for a few hours of celebration and community. Daniel proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, moving with a fluid grace that suggested natural rhythm and years of practice. He swung her through reels and waltzes, his hand firm at her waist, his smile wide and genuine, and she laughed more that night than she could remember laughing in years. They talked endlessly, discovering the contours of each other's thoughts and dreams. She told him about her love of reading, how she had devoured novels and poetry and philosophy in her father's library, seeking windows into lives and worlds beyond her own circumscribed existence. He revealed his own education, patchy but broad, learned from books borrowed from circuit judges and schoolteachers he had met in his travels, from conversations with native trackers who taught him to read the land like a text, from hard experience that had shown him the difference between theory and practice. "I always thought I would end up back in Texas," he told her one afternoon as they sat by a stream, watching the water rush past. "Build a ranch, raise cattle, live out my days doing honest work in a place I understood. But the more I see of this country, the less I want to settle. There is so much out here, Amelia, so much that is worth seeing and experiencing. I do not want to miss it by putting down roots too early." "But you said you wanted to stay in Sonora," she reminded him. "I want to stay where you are," he corrected. "That is different. If you were in Montana or New Mexico or anywhere else, that is where I would want to be." The implications of his words hung between them, unspoken but understood. This was more than attraction, more than a passing connection. This was something that could reshape both their lives if they let it. But complications were gathering like storm clouds. The railroad dispute that Mrs. Chen had mentioned was escalating. Workers and hired guns clashed with the ranchers' men in skirmishes that grew more violent each time. 3 men had been wounded in a gunfight near the contested land, and tensions in town were running high. The rancher, a man named Silas Hartwell, was well liked in Sonora, seen as someone who had worked hard to build something legitimate in country that rewarded toughness and determination. The railroad, on the other hand, was viewed with suspicion. A distant corporation with offices in Sacramento and stockholders in San Francisco, who cared nothing for the people whose lives would be disrupted by tracks and locomotives. Daniel found himself increasingly drawn into the conflict, despite his intentions to stay neutral. He knew some of the railroad workers from his time on construction crews up north, but he also sympathized with Hartwell's position that a man's land was his land, regardless of what some corporation's survey map claimed. When a group of workers cornered him in a saloon and demanded to know whose side he was on, he told them he was on the side of people not getting killed over something that could likely be resolved with honest negotiation and fair compensation. This answer satisfied no one, and Daniel found himself on the receiving end of threats from both camps. He told Amelia about it one evening with a frustration that bordered on anger. "This is what men do," he said. "They pick sides, draw lines, convince themselves that violence is the only answer, and then they wonder why everything turns to blood and regret." "Can you stop it?" she asked. "I do not know. Maybe, if both sides were willing to actually talk rather than just shout and shoot." He looked at her. "It would be easier to just ride out, let them settle it among themselves. But you will not do that." "No," he admitted, "because you are here and Mrs. Chen's son is here and all the other people who will get hurt when this explodes are here. I cannot just ride away from that." Amelia felt a swell of emotion that was part love and part fear. This man, this good, stubborn, principled man, would put himself in danger for people he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. It was admirable and infuriating in equal measure. She was falling in love with him, she realized. Completely, irrevocably in love in a way that made her engagement to Frederick seem like a child's imitation of the real thing. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, because love meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of loss, meant trusting someone with the parts of yourself that were most fragile and precious. "I am scared," she confessed. "Not of the railroad or the ranchers, but of this, of what I feel for you. I have never felt anything like this, Daniel. It is overwhelming." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like safety and home. "I know. I am scared too. But Amelia, I would rather be scared and alive with you than safe and numb without you. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," she whispered against his chest, and felt his arms tighten around her. The situation came to a head on a hot afternoon in late May. Word spread through Sonora that the railroad had hired a notorious enforcer named Dutch Carson to lead their men in a final push to take control of Hartwell's land. Carson had a reputation for ruthlessness, a former guerrilla fighter during the war who had turned his skills to the highest bidder afterward. His arrival meant bloodshed was not just likely but certain. Daniel went to see Hartwell that same day, riding out to the rancher's homestead with a proposition. Amelia insisted on going with him, and though he argued that it was too dangerous, she refused to be left behind. "You said you wanted to be where I am," she reminded him. "That means I go where you go." The Hartwell Ranch was a modest operation, a few hundred acres of grazing land watered by a creek that ran down from the mountains. Silas Hartwell himself was a man in his 50s, weathered and hard-eyed but fair-minded according to those who knew him. He welcomed them with caution, clearly wary of Daniel's intentions but willing to hear him out. "I think there is a way through this that does not involve anyone dying," Daniel said as they sat in Hartwell's front room. "The railroad needs right-of-way across your land. You want to be compensated fairly for that right-of-way. Those two things are not incompatible." "I have told them what I want," Hartwell said. $5,000 for an easement across the northern section where they want to lay track. That is fair value for land I worked hard to acquire and improve. They offered me $500 and said I could take it or leave it. Because they think they can just take it, Daniel said. And maybe they can if this comes down to legal battles and government intervention. But that will take time and money on both sides, and in the meantime, people will die. Dutch Carson does not have a reputation for restraint. So what are you proposing? Let me talk to the railroad representatives. If I can get them to agree to fair compensation, will you grant the easement? Hartwell studied him. Why do you care, Brennan? This is not your fight. Daniel glanced at Amelia, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. Let us say I have reasons to want this settled peacefully. Reasons that involve building a future in this town rather than riding away from another pointless conflict. Understanding dawned on Hartwell's face. He looked between Daniel and Amelia, then nodded slowly. All right. Get me $3,000, a legally binding easement agreement, and a guarantee that my water rights are protected, and I will let them build their damn railroad. They rode back to town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Amelia felt cautiously hopeful for the first time in days. Do you think they will agree? I think they will if I can make them understand the alternative, Daniel said. Dutch Carson does not come cheap. If they are willing to pay him, they should be willing to pay Hartwell instead and avoid the bloodshed. But the railroad representatives, when Daniel met with them the next morning, were not inclined to negotiate. The meeting took place in a back room of the town's nicest hotel, attended by two men in expensive suits who regarded Daniel with barely concealed contempt. They informed him that the corporation had legal authority to claim the land for public use, that Hartwell was obstructing progress, and that Dutch Carson had been hired specifically to remove that obstruction. So you would rather start a war that will cost you money, time, and lives than just pay the man fair value, Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. We do not negotiate with extortionists, one of the men replied coldly. He is not an extortionist, he is a landowner asking for fair compensation. There is a difference. Not to us. The man stood, indicating the meeting was over. Our decision is final, Mr. Brennan. I suggest you stay out of this unless you want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law. Daniel left the hotel furious and frustrated. He found Amelia at the boarding house and told her what had happened. They are fools, he said. Arrogant fools who think money and lawyers make them untouchable. What will you do? I do not know yet. But I am not going to stand by and watch them murder Silas Hartwell because he had the audacity to want fair treatment. Over the next few days, the tension in Sonora became unbearable. Dutch Carson and his men arrived, a dozen hard-faced killers who swaggered through town like an occupying army. They drank heavily, picked fights with anyone who looked at them wrong, and made it clear they were spoiling for violence. Hartwell, meanwhile, had called in friends and neighboring ranchers, men who owed him favors or shared his disgust with the railroad's tactics. The town felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Amelia watched Daniel struggle with the situation, saw the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He met with the sheriff, an aging man named Tucker who was clearly out of his depth, trying to convince him to intervene. He talked to the few reasonable voices among the railroad workers, men who did not want to see their friends killed in a land dispute. He even attempted to speak with Dutch Carson directly, though that conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before Carson's men threw him out of the saloon with threats of worse if he did not mind his own business. Through it all, Amelia stood beside him, offering what support she could. She helped Beatrice prepare extra food for the boarding house guests who were too nervous to go out to restaurants. She assisted Mrs. Chen in writing a letter to the railroad company pleading with them to reconsider, though they both knew it would likely be ignored. She held Daniel at night when exhaustion and frustration threatened to overwhelm him, whispering reassurances she was not sure she believed but knew he needed to hear. "I cannot save everyone," he said one night, his voice rough. "I know that, but I have to try, Amelia. Because if I do not, if I just stand by and watch this happen, what kind of man am I? The same kind of man who chose to stay in Sonora when his business was finished," she said. "The kind who cannot walk away from people in trouble. It is one of the things I love about you, even though it terrifies me." He went very still. Love. She had not meant to say it like that, so casually in the midst of everything else, but now that the word was out she could not take it back. "Yes, love, I love you, Daniel Brennan. I did not plan to, did not expect to, but there it is. I love you." He kissed her then with a desperation that spoke of fear and hope tangled together. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "I have loved you since that first night on the porch when you brought me coffee and looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. I just did not know if I should say it, if I had the right to say it when everything is so uncertain." "Say it now," she urged. "Say it as many times as you want. We do not know what tomorrow will bring, so let us at least have the truth tonight." They made love for the first time that night, slow and tender, and then urgent, learning the geography of each other's bodies with hands and mouths and whispered endearments. It was nothing like the clinical descriptions Amelia had received before her expected wedding, nothing like the duties she had been prepared to endure. It was passion and connection, vulnerability and strength, two people choosing each other completely in a moment of profound intimacy. Afterward, lying tangled together in her narrow bed, Amelia felt something settle inside her, a certainty that had been building since that first evening on the porch. This was right. This was real. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The violence she had feared came 2 days later. Dutch Carson and his men rode out to the Hartwell ranch at dawn with the intention of burning him out. But Hartwell had anticipated the move, and he and his supporters were ready. Gunfire erupted as Carson's men approached, and within minutes what should have been an intimidation tactic became a full battle. Daniel heard about it when a wounded railroad worker stumbled into town seeking the doctor. He did not hesitate, did not stop to think about the danger, just grabbed his rifle and rode toward the sounds of gunfire with the kind of resolve that Amelia recognized as both heroic and potentially suicidal. She could not sit idle at the boarding house while he rode into danger, so she followed on one of the stable horses, pushing the animal harder than was wise, her heart pounding with fear for Daniel's safety. By the time she reached the Hartwell ranch, the battle was in full chaos. Men were shooting from behind cover of buildings and wagons. Smoke filled the air, and the noise was deafening. She saw Daniel crouched behind a water trough, rifle to his shoulder, firing with careful precision at Carson's men who were trying to approach the main house. Several bodies lay motionless in the dirt, and she felt bile rise in her throat at the reality of violence she had only read about in sanitized newspaper accounts. Then she saw Dutch Carson himself, circling around the side of a barn, flanking Daniel's position. He was going to shoot Daniel in the back, and Daniel had no idea he was there. Amelia did not think, did not hesitate, just spurred her horse forward and screamed Daniel's name. He turned at her cry, saw Carson, and rolled behind better cover just as the gunman fired. The bullet that would have killed Daniel instead struck the water trough with a metallic clang. Carson saw Amelia then, and his face twisted with rage. He swung his gun toward her, and she froze, suddenly understanding that she was about to die. Time seemed to slow. She saw his finger tightening on the trigger, saw the barrel of the gun pointing directly at her chest, heard Daniel shouting something she could not make out over the roaring in her ears. Then Silas Hartwell shot Dutch Carson from the window of his house, a clean shot that dropped the gunman where he stood. The battle ended shortly after that. Carson's men, seeing their leader dead and facing determined resistance, broke and ran. The railroad workers who had reluctantly participated in the attack surrendered, hands raised, clearly relieved to have an excuse to stop fighting. The whole thing had lasted perhaps 20 minutes from start to finish, but Amelia felt like she had aged years in those minutes. Daniel reached her side as she dismounted on shaking legs. He pulled her into his arms, his body trembling as badly as hers. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice harsh with fear and anger. "What were you thinking, riding into the middle of a gunfight?" "I was thinking that I could not lose you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I saw him about to shoot you, and I could not let that happen. So you put yourself in the line of fire instead." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes blazing. "Amelia, if anything had happened to you, if I had lost you because you were trying to save me, but you did not lose me," she interrupted, gripping his shirt. "We are both alive. We are both here." He kissed her then, hard and fierce, a kiss that tasted of smoke and fear and overwhelming relief. When they finally broke apart, they were both crying, both clinging to each other like drowning people finding shore. The aftermath of the battle was complicated and messy. The sheriff arrested several of Carson's men for attempted murder and arson. The railroad representatives, facing a public relations disaster and potential criminal charges as accessories to violence, suddenly became much more willing to negotiate. Within a week, they had agreed to Hartwell's original terms, plus additional compensation for the damage done to his property and the loss of life among his supporters. The dispute was settled, but at a cost that weighed on everyone involved. 3 men had died in the battle, and several more bore injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The town held a somber memorial service, and even those who had supported the railroad's cause admitted that the violence had been unnecessary and tragic. Daniel struggled with his role in the aftermath. He had not killed anyone in the battle, had tried to fire only disabling shots, but he still felt responsible for the deaths. "I should have found a way to stop this sooner," he told Amelia. "I should have done more." "You did everything you could," she assured him. "You tried to negotiate, tried to make both sides see reason. You cannot blame yourself for the stubbornness and greed of men who refuse to listen. But I can learn from it, he said quietly. I can remember that sometimes trying to fix things is not enough. That sometimes the best you can do is protect the people you love and hope that is sufficient. They walked through this difficult time together, supporting each other through the grief and processing, slowly healing from the trauma of violence and near loss. And through it all, their love deepened and strengthened, tested by crisis and proven resilient. It was Beatrice who finally asked the question they had both been avoiding. One evening in early June, as the three of them sat in the boarding house kitchen drinking tea, she looked between Daniel and Amelia and said, "So what now? You two have been courting for 6 weeks, been through things that would break most couples and clearly love each other beyond reason. What are your intentions?" Daniel reached across the table and took Amelia's hand. "I want to marry her," he said simply. "If she will have me, I want to marry her and build a life together wherever that life takes us." Amelia felt her heart swell. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I will marry you." Beatrice smiled, looking satisfied. "Good, it is about time. Now, Amelia, there is something you should know before you make this commitment final. When I chose passion over duty all those years ago when I left my first husband for Robert, I did not regret it then, and I have never regretted it since. But that choice came with consequences. I lost my place in society, lost the respect of my family, lost the security I had always known. I do not regret the choice, but I will not pretend it was easy. Are you prepared for that?" Amelia thought about San Francisco, about the life she had left behind, the social standing, the wealth, the certainty of her future as Mrs. Frederick Worthington, Roman III. She thought about what people would say when they learned she had run away from her engagement to marry a bounty hunter and cowboy in a rough mining town. She thought about the scandal, the disapproval, the judgment. Then she looked at Daniel, at his honest eyes and calloused hands, and the face she had come to love more than safety or propriety or any of the things she had been raised to value. "I chose passion over duty when I came to Sonora," she said. "And I will make that choice again every day for the rest of my life if it means being with Daniel. I do not regret it." Daniel brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Passion deserves no regret ever," he said. "Not when it is real, not when it is honest, not when it leads you to the person you were meant to love." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the local church, witnessed by Beatrice and the boarding house residents and half the town of Sonora, who had come to care for the young couple who had helped bring peace to their community. Amelia wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself with Beatrice's help, simple and practical but beautiful in its simplicity. Daniel wore his best clothes, his hair freshly cut, his face clean-shaven, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. The preacher who performed the ceremony was the same one who lived at the boarding house, and he spoke eloquently about love as a choice, a daily decision to honor and cherish another person through good times and hard. He spoke of passion as a gift that should be treasured, not suppressed, a fire that warmed rather than consumed when tended with care and respect. And he spoke of duty, how true duty was not to the expectations of others, but to the commitments of the heart, to the promises made to the person standing beside you. When Daniel slipped the simple gold band on her finger and promised to love her for the rest of his days, Amelia felt a joy so complete, it seemed impossible that she had ever considered a different future. When she made her own promises in return, she meant every word with an intensity that surprised her, a fierce determination to build a life worthy of the love they had found. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing that went on into the night. Mrs. Chen made dumplings and taught Amelia how to say "married happiness" in Cantonese. Silas Hartwell came to town specially for the occasion, bringing a set of hand-tooled leather saddlebags as a wedding gift and clapping Daniel on the back with genuine affection. Even the railroad workers who remained in town stopped by to offer congratulations, their earlier tensions forgotten in the face of such obvious happiness. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Daniel took Amelia's hand and led her upstairs to the room they would now share, a larger space that Beatrice had prepared for them with fresh linens and wildflowers in a vase on the dresser. He closed the door behind them and pulled her into his arms, swaying gently to the distant sounds of music still playing below. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, testing out the name. "How does it feel?" "Right," she said without hesitation. "It feels completely right." They made love as husband and wife for the first time, taking their time now that there was no urgency, now that they had the rest of their lives stretching before them. Afterward, lying in the darkness with her head on his chest and his hand stroking her hair, Amelia thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her father's death, Frederick's cold proposal, the decision to flee to Sonora, the terror and beauty of falling in love with a man so different from everything she had known. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed in San Francisco?" Daniel asked quietly. "If you had married Frederick and lived the life your father planned for you?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But wondering is not the same as regret. I think I would have been comfortable, respectable, probably even content in a surface kind of way. But I would never have known what this feels like, what passion feels like, what it means to choose love over obligation." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "My aunt said she chose passion over duty and never regretted it. I understand now what she meant. This feeling, what we have, it is worth more than all the security and status in the world." "Passion deserves no regret ever," Daniel repeated, echoing his words from their wedding ceremony. "That is something I learned from watching people waste their lives in pursuit of things that do not matter. Money, power, reputation, those things fade and crumble. But love, real love, that lasts." They talked into the night, making plans for their future, dreams they would build together. Daniel wanted to eventually buy a piece of land, maybe not far from Sonora, somewhere they could raise horses and children, build something permanent without giving up the freedom that had drawn them both to frontier life. Amelia wanted to continue helping at the boarding house, maybe even expand it, create a place where people in transition could find support and community as she had. They talked about traveling together, seeing more of the West, experiencing the vast and varied landscapes that Daniel had described to her in his stories. But mostly they talked about each other, about the small and large ways they had changed each other's lives, about the miracle of finding exactly the right person at exactly the right time. They fell asleep tangled together, satisfied and hopeful, ready to face whatever came next as partners and lovers and friends. The months that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Daniel continued his work finding people, though he was more selective now about which jobs he accepted, unwilling to be away from Amelia for long stretches. Amelia became indispensable at the boarding house, her organizational skills and natural warmth making her beloved by the rotating cast of guests. They saved money carefully, planning for the future they had envisioned together. Word eventually reached Amelia from San Francisco. A letter arrived from Frederick, formal and cold, officially releasing her from their engagement and informing her that he had begun courting another woman from a similarly prominent family. There was no mention of her father, no expression of concern for her well-being, just a few short paragraphs that made clear he considered the matter closed. She felt nothing reading it, no regret or sadness or even anger, just a distant acknowledgement that she had once been connected to this man, and now was not. A second letter came from her father's attorney, informing her that after debts were settled and business matters resolved, a small inheritance remained that would be held in trust for her. It was not the fortune she might have expected, but it was enough to provide security, enough to help them buy that land they wanted. She showed the letter to Daniel, who read it carefully and then folded it and handed it back. "This is your money," he said, "your inheritance from your father. If you want to invest it in land, that is your decision, but I want to be clear that I married you for love, not for whatever assets you might bring to the marriage." "I know that," she assured him. "But we are partners, Daniel. What is mine is yours, and what we build together belongs to both of us." They purchased 100 acres of land in the rolling hills east of Sonora in the spring of 1879, almost exactly a year after Amelia had first arrived in town. It was beautiful country, with good water and grazing, sheltered valleys and commanding views, the kind of place where you could imagine growing old and happy. They built a modest house together, Daniel doing most of the heavy construction with help from neighbors, Amelia planning the layout and creating a home that felt warm and welcoming. Beatrice came to visit often, clearly delighted with how things had worked out for her niece. "I am proud of you," she told Amelia one afternoon as they stood on the porch of the new house, looking out over land that seemed to glow gold in the late sun. "You took a chance on yourself, on love, on a different kind of life. That takes courage." "I learned from the best," Amelia replied, squeezing her aunt's hand. "You showed me it was possible to choose passion over duty and not just survive but thrive." "Have you regretted it at all?" Beatrice asked. "In the hard moments when money was tight or the work was difficult, did you ever wish you had stayed in San Francisco?" Amelia considered the question seriously. There had been hard moments, times when her hands were cracked and bleeding from work, when winter cold seeped through the walls of their not yet finished house, when Daniel was away for days tracking someone, and she felt lonely and uncertain. But even in those moments, she had never wished to be back in her old life. "Not once," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life, our life, it is everything I did not know I wanted. I look at Daniel, and I feel grateful every day that I had the courage to walk away from what was expected and find what was real." They started raising horses that first year, just a few mares and a good stallion, building slowly and carefully. Daniel proved to have a gift for it, a patience and understanding of the animals that allowed him to gentle even the most skittish or difficult horses. Amelia kept the books and managed the business side, applying the education she had received in San Francisco to more practical purposes than planning social events. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths, supporting each other's weaknesses. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Amelia's father, was born in the winter of 1880. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, rocking the baby through long nights when he fussed, singing old cowboy songs in a voice that was surprisingly sweet, looking at his son with an expression of wonder and fierce protectiveness. Amelia had worried during her pregnancy about whether she would be a good mother, whether she would know what to do, but found that love and instinct carried her through the uncertainties. Mrs. Chen traveled from the boarding house to help with the birth and the first difficult weeks after. She taught Amelia traditional Chinese practices for new mothers, brought herbal teas that helped with milk production and healing, and doted on baby Thomas with a grandmother's affection. The older woman had become dear to both of them, a bridge between Amelia's old life and new, a reminder that family was created through love and choice as much as blood. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch grew as well. They added cattle to their operation, expanded the horse herd, built additional outbuildings and corrals. Daniel hired a young man named Miguel from town to help with the work, and they taught him everything they knew about ranching, treating him more like family than employee. The land prospered under their care, and their reputation for raising good horses spread throughout the region. Amelia thought often during those years about the night she had confessed her regrets to Daniel, the night before their wedding when fear of the unknown had momentarily shaken her resolve. She had said she chose passion over duty and regretted it, speaking her deepest fear aloud, testing whether he would still want her if she admitted to doubt. And he had said those words that had become their shared truth, their guiding principle, the foundation of their life together. Passion deserves no regret ever. She understood now what he had meant, what her Aunt Beatrice had been trying to tell her all along. Regret was what happened when you denied your true self, when you chose safety over authenticity, when you let fear or obligation override the deep knowing of your own heart. She had felt regret in San Francisco, watching her life unspool in predetermined patterns that left her feeling hollow and false. She had felt regret standing beside her father's casket, realizing she would never have the courage to tell him she wanted something different. But since leaving, since meeting Daniel, since choosing love and passion and the terrifying freedom of forging her own path, she had felt many things, fear and joy and exhaustion and exhilaration, but never regret. Not even in the hardest moments, because every challenge was faced with someone she loved, every difficulty overcome together, every triumph shared. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Amelia's mother, was born in the summer of 1882. She was a fierce little thing from birth, all determination and fire, and Amelia saw in her daughter's face the courage she had found in herself, the strength to be more than circumstances dictated. Daniel adored his daughter with a tenderness that made Amelia fall in love with him all over again, watching him cradle the baby with calloused hands that were so gentle, singing to her the same songs he had sung to Thomas, promising her in whispers that he would teach her to ride and shoot and think for herself. Life on the ranch settled into a pattern that felt both solid and full of possibility. The children grew healthy and happy, running wild on the land, learning to help with chores as soon as they were able, absorbing the lessons their parents taught through word and example about hard work, integrity, and choosing love over fear. The horse operation flourished, with buyers coming from as far as San Francisco to purchase their animals. The cattle provided steady income, and Daniel's occasional work tracking people added to their savings. Beatrice visited often, watching her great-niece and great-nephew with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see the consequences of difficult choices bear good fruit. She told them stories of the old days, of Amelia's father as a young man before responsibility hardened him, of Amelia's mother who had been kind and gentle and died too young, of her own Robert and the brief, burning love they had shared before death took him. "You have built something beautiful here," Beatrice said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. Thomas was 6 and Margaret was 4, both playing in the yard with a puppy Daniel had brought home from town. Not just the ranch, though that is impressive, but the life, the family, the love. "You chose well, Amelia." "I chose Daniel," Amelia said simply, "and he chose me. Everything else followed from that." Daniel emerged from the barn where he had been checking on a mare about to foal. He saw them on the porch and smiled, That same smile that had first captured Amelia's attention years ago in the boarding house. Genuine and warm and full of life. He climbed the steps and settled beside Amelia, his arm going around her shoulders in a gesture so familiar and comfortable it was like breathing. "What are we talking about?" he asked. "Choices," Beatrice said. "And how the ones we made shaped who we became. Any regrets?" Daniel asked his wife, the question teasing but with an undercurrent of real curiosity. Amelia leaned into him, solid and warm and home. "Not a single one. You were right that night before our wedding. Passion deserves no regret ever, not when it is honest, not when it leads you to love." "I was right about a lot of things," Daniel said with mock arrogance, then laughed when she elbowed him gently in the ribs. "But mostly I was right about you, about us, about the life we could build if we had the courage to try." They sat together as the evening deepened, watching their children play, feeling the weight of years together and years still to come. The land around them seemed to glow in the fading light, golden and beautiful and full of promise. This was what they had chosen, this life of hard work and deep love, of children and horses and seasons turning, of growing old together in a place they had built with their own hands and hearts. Later that night, after the children were asleep and Beatrice had retired to the guest room, Daniel and Amelia lay in their bed talking quietly. It was something they still did, talking in the darkness about dreams and fears and memories, keeping the connection between them strong through words and touch and laughter. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if I had ridden out of Sonora that day?" Daniel asked. "If I had finished my business and moved on like I planned?" "Sometimes," Amelia admitted. "But it is not a thought I linger on because you did not leave. You stayed and we found each other, and everything that followed was because we both had the courage to take a chance on something real." "I almost did leave, you know," he confessed. "That morning before I decided to stay, I had my bag packed, my horse saddled, was ready to ride. But then I thought about you, about the way you had looked at me on the porch that first night, like I was someone worth knowing. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth staying for. Best decision I ever made." She kissed him, long and sweet, pouring into it all the love and gratitude and bone-deep satisfaction she felt. "I love you, Daniel Brennan. I loved you when I was terrified and uncertain, and I love you now when I am confident and sure. I will love you when we are old and gray and our children have children of their own. That is my promise to you." "And I love you, Amelia Brennan," he replied. "You took a chance on a cowboy and drifter when you could have had security and status. You chose passion over duty, and you have never made me regret that you did. That is a gift I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of." They made love then, tender and familiar. The passion between them matured but not diminished by years of marriage. It was different than it had been in those first wild months, less urgent perhaps but deeper, informed by shared history and mutual trust, and the profound intimacy of building a life together. Afterward, holding each other in the darkness, they talked about the future, the things they still wanted to do and see, the dreams they had for their children, the life they would continue building day by day. The years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved horses and books in equal measure, already showing signs of the thoughtful, honorable man he would become. Margaret was all fire and determination, demanding to be taught to ride as soon as her legs were long enough to grip a saddle, following her father everywhere and absorbing his lessons about the land and animals. A third child, another son they named Robert after Beatrice's lost love, was born in 1885, completing their family. The ranch prospered, and they prospered with it. Daniel's reputation as a horse trainer spread far and wide, and buyers came from all over California and Nevada to purchase his animals. Amelia managed the business with skill and acumen that would have surprised no one who had known her in San Francisco, but continually amazed the people of Sonora, who had watched her transform from city girl to capable rancher's wife. They gave to their community, helping neighbors in need, supporting the school and church, hosting gatherings that brought people together. Beatrice lived to see all three of her great-nieces and great-nephews grow past childhood, a blessing she treasured openly. She died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1890, surrounded by the family she had helped create through her example and courage. Her funeral was attended by everyone in Sonora who had known her, a testament to the life she had built after choosing passion over duty all those years ago. At the funeral, Amelia spoke briefly about her aunt, about the lessons she had learned from a woman who refused to let society's expectations define her worth or limit her choices. She told me once that she chose passion over duty and never regretted it, Amelia said, her voice strong despite her grief. She showed me through her example that love and authenticity and courage matter more than reputation or security. I am who I am because she had the bravery to be herself, and my children exist because I followed her example. That is a legacy worth celebrating. As her children grew older, Amelia made sure they knew the story of how their parents had met and fallen in love. She told them about the boarding house in Sonora, about a cowboy who decided to stay when he could have left, about choosing passion over duty and building a life based on love rather than obligation. She wanted them to understand that the best things in life often required courage, that taking chances on what felt true and real was worth the risk of uncertainty. Thomas, at 15, asked her once if she had really been engaged to someone else when she met his father. They were working together in the garden, a spring afternoon with the smell of earth and growing things all around them, and the question came out of nowhere. I was, Amelia confirmed. To a man named Frederick Worthington. It was arranged by our families, meant to be a good business merger. Did you love him? No. I respected him, I suppose, but I did not love him. I did not even really know him, not in any way that mattered. The engagement was about duty and expectation, not about actual feeling or connection. Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing this. Were you scared when you left, when you came here instead of marrying him? Terrified, she admitted. I was leaving behind everything I had ever known, traveling to a place I had never seen to stay with an aunt the family had disowned. I had no idea what I would find or what would happen. But I was more scared of the life I was leaving behind, the future that felt like a cage closing around me. So I chose fear of the unknown over certainty of being unhappy. And then you met Dad. And then I met your father, she agreed, smiling at the memory. And everything changed. He showed me what it felt like to actually want someone, to connect with someone on every level, mind and heart and body. He taught me that passion was not something to be ashamed of or suppressed, but something to be celebrated and nurtured. We built this life together, this family, and I have never once regretted choosing him over the safe, respectable life I was supposed to live. Thomas looked at his mother, really looked at her, seeming to see her perhaps for the first time as a person rather than just a parent. I hope I am that brave when the time comes to make my own choices. You will be, Amelia assured him, because you were raised to think for yourself, to follow your heart, to choose authenticity over obligation. That is what your father and I wanted for all of you, the freedom to become who you are meant to be rather than who others expect you to be. Margaret, at 13, was already showing signs of the independent woman she would become. She had no interest in the domestic arts that most girls her age were expected to master, preferring instead to work with the horses and cattle, to ride the range with her father and brothers, to get dirty and tired and thoroughly happy. She asked Amelia once if it was wrong to want something different than what was expected. "It is not wrong," Amelia told her daughter firmly. "It is brave. When I was your age, I was being groomed to be a society wife, taught to run a household and host parties and support my husband's ambitions. But that was not who I really was, and it took me years to figure that out, to find the courage to walk away from those expectations and discover what I actually wanted." "What if what I want is not what everyone else thinks I should want?" Margaret asked, her young face serious. "Then you want what you want, and that is enough. Your worth is not determined by how well you meet others' expectations. It is determined by how honestly you live your own life, how true you are to your own heart." Amelia pulled her daughter close. "You are strong and smart and capable. Do not let anyone convince you to be less than you are just because it makes them more comfortable." Robert, the youngest, was still a child when these conversations happened, but he absorbed the lessons nonetheless. He saw his parents' partnership, the way they respected and supported each other, the way they made decisions together and faced challenges as a team. He saw his mother's strength and his father's gentleness, learned that love was not about one person dominating or diminishing the other, but about two people choosing each other every day. The years rolled on. The children grew and eventually left to forge their own paths. Thomas went east to attend university, drawn to learning and books in a way that made both his parents proud. Margaret refused all attempts at traditional courtship, eventually leaving to work on a ranch up near the Oregon border where women were judged by their skill with horses rather than their conformity to social expectations. Robert stayed closest to home, working the ranch with his aging father, eventually bringing home a wife of his own, a schoolteacher from Sacramento who had grown tired of city life and wanted something more authentic. Daniel and Amelia grew older together, their bodies showing the wear of hard years but their connection remaining strong. They still talked in the darkness, still made love though less frequently as age caught up with them, still looked at each other across a room and felt that spark of recognition and love that had drawn them together decades earlier. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Amelia by taking her back to Sonora, back to the boarding house where they had met. The building looked older now, showing its age, though it was still painted that defiant yellow and still run with care by the family who had purchased it after Beatrice's death. They stood on the back porch where they had shared their first coffee, their first real conversation, their first intimation that something significant was beginning. "I have been thinking about that night," Daniel said, his hand finding hers automatically, fingers interlacing in a pattern worn smooth by decades of practice. "The night before our wedding when you told me you chose passion over duty and regretted it. Do you remember what you said?" "I said I was scared," Amelia recalled. "I told you I had walked away from everything safe and certain, and in that moment of fear, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. And I told you that passion deserves no regret ever." He turned to face her, his weathered cowboy face creased with time but still handsome to her eyes, still the face she loved most in all the world. "Was I right? Have you regretted it, any of it, in these 25 years?" She did not have to think about her answer. Not for a single moment. Not when money was tight or the work was hard. Not when the children were sick or crops failed or horses died. Not when we fought or when life felt overwhelming. Because even in the worst moments, I was living my life with you, building something real and honest and ours. How could I regret that? I have loved you every day of these 25 years, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. Some days were easier than others, some were damn near impossible, but I loved you through all of them. You took a chance on me, on us, on this life we have built. You chose passion over duty, and that choice gave me everything I have, everything I am. I need you to know that. She kissed him then, there on the porch where it had all begun, kissed him with all the love and gratitude and bone-deep satisfaction of a life fully lived. Around them, Sonora went about its evening business, people walking past on the street below, lights coming on in windows, the piano music from a nearby saloon drifting on the night air. But for Amelia and Daniel, there was only this moment, this connection, this profound appreciation for the journey they had taken together. They stayed in Sonora for a few days, visiting old friends, walking familiar streets, remembering their younger selves and the choices they had made. They had dinner with Mrs. Chen, now elderly and frail but still sharp of mind and generous of spirit. They visited the cemetery where Beatrice was buried, placing flowers on her grave and thanking her silently for the example she had set, the courage she had shown, the unconditional love she had offered when Amelia needed it most. On the last evening before returning home, they stood at the edge of town looking east toward the hills where their ranch waited. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the land stretched out before them full of memory and meaning. "You think we did right?" Amelia asked. "With the children, with the life we built, with the choices we made." "I think we did the best we could," Daniel replied. "We showed them what love looks like when it is real and honest. We taught them to choose authenticity over obligation, passion over duty, courage over fear. They will make their own choices, their own mistakes, build their own lives. But they will do it knowing that choosing from the heart is always worth the risk. Passion deserves no regret ever," Amelia said softly, the words that had become their shared creed. "Never," Daniel agreed, pulling her close. "Not when you are choosing truth, not when you are choosing love, not when you are choosing to actually live rather than just exist." They returned to the ranch the next day, to the life they had built and the land they had made prosper through years of work and care. Robert and his wife had kept things running smoothly in their absence, the horses healthy and the cattle tended. The house welcomed them back with the comfort of familiar walls and beloved possessions, the accumulated memories of a lifetime together. As they grew older still, as their hair turned white and their steps slowed, Daniel and Amelia spent more time on the porch of their home, watching the seasons turn, enjoying the peace of a life well lived. Grandchildren came to visit, children of their children who carried forward the family legacy in faces and gestures and attitudes. They told these grandchildren stories of the old days, of Sonora and boarding houses, of choosing passion over duty, of building something lasting from courage and love. Thomas brought his children to visit, a daughter who wanted to be a doctor, and a son who wrote poetry. Margaret came less frequently, occupied with running her own ranch up north, but when she did visit, she brought stories of independence and hard-won respect that made her mother's heart swell with pride. Robert's children, raised on the ranch, were already showing signs of carrying on the tradition, learning to work with horses and land in ways that honored what their grandparents had begun. Daniel's health began to fail in his late 60s, the hard years of frontier life catching up with him. He faced decline with the same quiet courage he had brought to everything else, never complaining, making dark jokes about getting old, focusing on what he could still do rather than what he had lost. Amelia stayed beside him through it all, as she had stayed beside him through everything for 40 years, her hand in his, her love unwavering. On a spring morning in 1905, with wildflowers blooming on the hills and new foals running in the paddocks, Daniel died peacefully in the bed he had shared with Amelia for decades. She held him as he took his last breath, whispered her love into his ear, told him she would see him again when her own time came. The grief was enormous, a wave that threatened to drown her, but beneath it was gratitude, profound and sustaining gratitude for the years they had shared, the life they had built, the love that had shaped and defined her. She lived another 6 years without him, years spent with family and memory, working the ranch with Robert's help until she could no longer manage the physical demands, then simply sitting on the porch and watching the land she loved. She thought often of that conversation with her aunt so many years ago, of Beatrice's words about choosing passion over duty. She thought of Daniel's response, his firm belief that passion deserves no regret ever. She had lived that truth for 47 years since leaving San Francisco. She had chosen love over security, passion over duty, authenticity over obligation. She had built a life with a cowboy who decided to stay when he could have left, raised children to think for themselves and follow their hearts, created something lasting and meaningful on raw land through hard work and love. And now, as her own life drew toward its close, she could say with absolute certainty that she had never once regretted her choice. Not in the hard times or the easy ones, not in sickness or health, not in youth or age. She had chosen passion, and that choice had given her everything worth having. On a summer evening in 1911, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Amelia died in the same bedroom where Daniel had died 6 years earlier. Her last words, whispered to Thomas, who sat beside her holding her hand, were these: "I chose passion over duty, and I never regretted it." Not once, not ever. Tell your children that. Tell them that love matters more than anything, that courage is choosing with your heart even when your head says it is foolish, that the best life is the one you build with your own hands according to your own truth. They buried her beside Daniel on the hillside overlooking the ranch, under a spreading oak tree where they had often sat together watching the sunset. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates and these words. They chose each other, and everything else followed. The ranch continued under Robert's care, and then under his children's care, and then under their children's care, each generation adding to what Daniel and Amelia had started, building on the foundation of love and courage and authenticity that had defined the original homestead. The story of how it all began, of a society woman who fled her engagement and a cowboy who decided to stay, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what was possible when you had the courage to choose with your heart. And always, whenever the story was told, it ended with the same words, the phrase that had become the family motto, the truth that Daniel and Amelia had lived and proved through their long life together. Passion deserves no regret ever. Not when it is real, not when it is honest, not when it leads you home. In Sonora, where it had all begun, people still spoke of the Brennans decades later. The boarding house was long gone, replaced by a brick building that housed shops and offices, but old-timers remembered Beatrice Norton and her niece from San Francisco, remembered the cowboy who had brought peace to a railroad dispute, remembered the love story that had captured imaginations in a rough mining town where romance often took a back seat to survival. The land they had purchased and improved became some of the most prosperous ranch country in the region. The horses they bred became famous throughout California and beyond, known for their intelligence and stamina and the care that went into their training. The family they created spread across the West, teachers and ranchers and doctors and poets, all carrying forward the lesson that choosing authentically, choosing with passion, choosing love over obligation was worth whatever price had to be paid. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slanted golden across the hills and the air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, people claimed you could see them. An elegant woman in simple dress and a tall cowboy walking hand in hand across land they had loved, still choosing each other, still living the truth that passion deserves no regret ever, not in life and not in whatever came after, not when the choice was made with courage and honored with a lifetime of love.